Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Corey. I'm a professor of political science in the honors program at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, even if virtually. And my thanks to the organizers of the conference who have put together a really wonderful set of speakers, and the topics are very much worth discussing. I've been asked to talk this morning about the question of what is wokeness and where did it originate, where did it come from, who started using the term, and I'll be talking about that, but I'll also want to point out that wokeness is, in a certain sense, another way of talking about identity politics. Politics is a way of understanding political activity based on identity groups, certain groups that come together in order to celebrate or make known a different kind of identity. Contrast that, say, with interest groups that would form and pursue that interest on the basis of things like neighborhood. You can imagine a neighborhood group organizing politically, or a group that had an interest in bringing down taxes. All of these interests are not based on the participants' identities per se, but contemporary identity politics, as we all know pretty well, does require that you share part of the identity with the group that you are allying with to pursue a cause. So this term comes out of something that took place in 1977. There was a group of Black feminist lesbians who called themselves the Combahee River Collective. And this group got together over the course of really 6 or 7 years, 1974 to 1980. But in 1977, they came out with a statement. And that's where the term identity politics was used for the first time. And they were saying, we as Black lesbian feminist women are not simply feminists. We don't simply ally with white feminists. We're also not simply Black. We don't simply ally with all the Black men who are also Black. We are our own distinct group. And that's the origin, really, of the term identity politics. Since then, it's been a long time, since 1977, things have changed quite a bit. Identity politics has morphed and transformed. And I want to talk about a few of the ways that it is being used, primarily in my context in the universities, and to describe the mechanisms of identity politics that we see very often, and why those are important, and how those have really transformed academia and then have been transferred themselves into the business world, as I'm sure many of you all are familiar with. Let me begin by really starting out to say, to try to explain the difference between, say, a conservative understanding of identity politics, which is largely critical, and a progressive understanding of identity politics, which is by and large not critical. It is much more celebratory. We might understand the conservative story of identity politics, especially in the university, to be something like this. Radical professors took their jobs in the universities in the 1960s and late 1960s and 1970s, then spawned a whole generation of their students who then went on to take the university jobs in the 70s and 80s. And what these people did was to transform the universities from their traditional role of preserving sort of the inheritance of the West and passing it on in the ordinary courses like history and philosophy and English literature and so on. Instead of teaching courses like that, they began what are called grievance studies courses, women's studies, gay studies, peace studies. I mean, the list is endless. And what happens there is that the fields are transformed from sort of objective, here's what happened, into let me investigate on the basis of a set of identities what the world looks like from the point of view of, say, just to take an example, a woman. So women's studies, very prominent during these years. Conservatives say this was a derailment of the university and it should not have happened. And now we're mopping up from the damage. We have multiple generations of people who have followed in these footsteps of the original radical professors, and the universities have gotten completely off track. Now, I personally am somewhat sympathetic to that story. I think there's a lot of truth to it. But let me give you the other side of the story. And this is from people who do not think of themselves as identity politics folks, but are invested in what they would call the politics of recognition. Their story goes something like this. It's true that radicals got into the university in the late 60s, early 70s, but what they were trying to do was a kind of breaking free of the hegemony or the dominance of the white male professoriate. And so what that meant is that they had to assert their identities in a way that was far more aggressive than the other, than say history or English would have allowed them to do. So for example, women's studies, the entire focus of that field is to talk about women's identity as women and the differences of women from, say, men. The identity of the people doing the work, the research, the writing, the scholarship was at the center of all their projects. And moreover, this is seen as a good thing. It is a way of allowing people whose identities had been, as they saw it, marginalized, and sometimes they were, to enter into positions of power in the universities, to take over professorships and so on. It was a way of celebrating identity, not saying, I'm going to become an American, I'm going to become a citizen of the liberal polity, but to say, I am a woman, I am a Black person, I am this or that, and then sort of carving out a special place on the basis of what had formerly been a source of oppression. So it's very much to the advantage of groups that they retain the identity that they came in with. Think about what would be lost if they gave up that identity. Women have enormous political power. I'm using women just because it's easy to use, and I happen to be a woman. I suppose that's helpful. But women have enormous power as a bloc. And to retain the notion that oppression was part of the formation of the identity group is very important for going forward in identity politics and in wokeness. Now, let me talk about 4 separate ideas. They're all related. They could easily each form a lecture of their own. But I'll begin with the concept of intersectionality. Perhaps you've heard of intersectionality. It's a very popular concept right now, and it really undergirds all of this world of identity politics, and you need to know what it is. So let me try to explain intersectionality. Intersectionality is an idea that was developed by a law professor in 1989. The professor's name is Kimberly Crenshaw. She's very famous now. The world of intersectionality is a huge part of almost every academic subject at this point. What Crenshaw argued was that Black women were subject to oppression in a different way from white women or from Black men. She uses an example of a case in law that had to do with General Motors, and the women sued a group of Black women sued General Motors because they had been discriminated against, and they said they couldn't sue on the basis of being women because white women hadn't been treated the same way. They also couldn't sue on the basis of being Black because Black men hadn't been treated the same way. So they wanted to say, look, there's something constitutive, there's something special about our grouping as a group of Black women. And what they said was that their oppression actually intersected on 2 different, actually 2 forms of oppression intersected. And the 2 forms of oppression were being Black and being a woman. And that created a new category of oppression, the oppression that Black women felt. So intersectionality is more or less saying these multiple layers or multiple vectors of oppression can intersect and form a new kind of oppression. So what does this mean? Well, it means that every kind of oppression is potentially intersectional, so that you could be a Black woman, you could be a Black lesbian woman, you could be a Black lesbian disabled woman, and all those categories intersected to form different subcategories. And what it means is the possibilities for oppression and privilege. Let's be clear about that. Certain people have privilege as well, and they're sort of intersectionally privileged. For example, of course, you're going to be familiar with this, all white men have a maximum of privilege, according to this theory. But people can have lots of different kinds of intersecting oppression. And this has been manifestly used to create new identity groups. It really is the underlying theory beneath identity politics as a whole and beneath wokeness. So it's no longer that it's just women, men, Black and white, but all the different kinds of oppression can intersect to form new categories. So that in a very, very quick way is the notion of intersectionality. 2 other concepts in a way, go together with respect to wokeness. And one is the notion of microaggressions. This has also come into popular usage in the last, well, really 12, 13 years. The concept was invented in 1970 by a Black professor who said, I've actually been subject to a lot of microaggressions. In other words, people doing things that were prejudiced, but not violently prejudiced, maybe not explicitly prejudiced. Things like serving him last in a line where white people and he had come at the same time. Things like being passed up by taxi cabs when they would go and serve a white person. Things that are often pretty clear in being prejudiced, but not dramatic, not terrible prejudice. And he called these microaggressions. I think as far as that goes, that's probably pretty real. The way that is described, though, is not the modern notion of microaggressions. Modern microaggressions came about in 2007 and were really put on the radar by a man named Darrell Wing Sue, who was a professor at Teachers College at Columbia. And he said there were three kinds of microaggressions. There was a micro assault, a micro invalidation, and a third he called a micro insult. All of these are related to the kind of microaggressions that Chester Pierce had talked about. The micro assault is very much that somebody's just rude to someone on the basis of race or gender or sexual orientation. I think that's okay so far as it goes. In the micro insult, this is where we get into the how to say it, the less obvious, maybe less real microaggressions. These are subtle snubs, frequently unknown to the perpetrator. Now, interestingly, Sue talks about the person who delivers the microaggression as the perpetrator, the person who receives the microaggression as the victim. These may include comments like, I believe the most qualified person should get the job regardless of race. Something like that, maybe to somebody who's not versed in microaggression sounds just like a comment, but to someone who wants to interpret it as a microaggression, they would say, this is invalidating me because you're not seeing my race. I feel hurt by what you said. Doesn't really matter if the perpetrator meant it to be aggressive. If the victim feels it as aggression, then it is indeed a microaggression. So this is where things start to get a little dicey. How exactly do we know if a microaggression has occurred? Well, you can't ask the perpetrator because it may well be unconscious aggression, according to Darrell Wing Sue. The victim is the one who determines whether there has been a microaggression. And this is extremely problematic for all kinds of ways that you could easily see, because if someone accuses you of a microaggression, regardless of your intent, you stand guilty. So this is a big part of wokeness on campus. We have microaggression trainings. We have all sorts of other trainings. The other concept that I want to mention briefly here is the notion of unconscious or implicit bias. In implicit bias, you are assumed to have unconscious, again, aggression toward people of different races or genders or sexual orientations. And there are tests that are online. You can go search them out as implicit association tests that are supposed to be predictive of your implicit aggressions, implicit biases. And the theory here is that if you could get in touch with those implicit biases, which may be unconscious to you, and could change them, then your behavior would change and you would be more or less a better, fairer person who is more hospitable to diversity. And the problem here is that there has been little evidence to support the idea that implicit bias measures can be changed or that they have any effect whatsoever on behavior. Nevertheless, they are a crucial part of diversity trainings on campuses, probably in businesses as well. I'm sure they must be. Again, with both microaggression and implicit bias, the idea is that you have you exist, or your thoughts exist at a level that you may not be conscious of, and that you are therefore prejudiced against people who differ from you, and you need to be trained out of that. So very much of what goes on campuses and elsewhere is a kind of training to put you in touch with the bias and the unconscious aggression, and then to train you out of it. Okay, one final mechanism I want to just mention here. I mean, again, as I said, any of these could be expanded quite a bit. Is a notion of what's called cultural humility. And cultural humility is the less well-known of these four concepts. So I remember I began with intersectionality, went to microaggressions, implicit bias, and now cultural humility. Cultural humility is a way of inverting power relations so that people who were formerly in power become sort of co-adjudicators, investigators in a variety of relationships. So for example, you might have gone in the past to a doctor and said, doctor, I have these symptoms, tell me what to do. And cultural humility says, in the new way of understanding the doctor-patient relationship, we ought not to go to the doctor and defer to everything the doctor says, but the doctor needs to put himself or herself down on my level, listen to me, take into account my full situation. Some of this is common sense, of course. This would be a good doctor. But the notion here is that then the doctor and patient are equals in a way that is supposed to yield better outcomes for the patient. Now, this paradigm comes out of nursing and social work, and then eventually goes into medicine. But it's now being used on the university campus to say that teachers should be no longer in positions of authority, but actually defer to the students, often letting the students lead through their interests, lead class through their interests, doing what's called flipping the classroom. All of this in order to equalize and democratize relations between teachers and students, and really between all authorities and the people they are supposed to oppress. So you see these four notions work together to really put together this idea of what is identity politics. Well, it's intersecting oppressions. It relies often on a notion of the unconscious. And finally, it aims at flattening power disparities and allowing a true democratic process to go forward. There are many things we might say about identity politics and wokeness. It's easy to be critical of them. The politics of recognition people, the people who have embraced identity politics, would say, look, this is allowing whole classes of people who have not been in businesses, in universities, in positions of power, to enter into those positions of power and to be seen for who they are and for their differences. And these people are certainly right that there is oppression in the world, and it manifests in different ways with respect to different groups of people. The problem I see as a conservative is that it does not lend itself to any kind of civic unity. If we are constantly being asked to identify ourselves as members of groups, discrete groups, and sometimes ever more discrete groups, depending on the theory of intersectionality, depending on how many identity categories we fall into, it's very hard to relate to one another as equals, because you're constantly, and maybe you've had this experience, you're constantly being asked to think, well, do I have more or less privilege than the person I'm talking to? Can I say this or can I say that? And it becomes very hard to interact in a healthy political, civil society with these kinds of categories in the back of your mind. And I think this is a really serious problem for universities going forward, and probably also for the business world, and certainly for our political world as well. That's a very quick overview, but thanks for listening this morning.